Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our Simplifying DLP with Symantec ICA. My name is Ken Becker, and I am the project manager here at NetX. Presenting to you today will be Kyle Black of Bay Dynamics. But before I turn it over to Kyle, I just wanted to take a few minutes to let you know who we are as a company and what we do. We consider ourselves an engineering company first and hold over 50 technical accreditations for both the Symantec and Veritas portfolio, including archiving, e-discovery, data protection, high availability, mobile management, and enterprise security, just to name a few. With that being said, we appreciate you joining our webinar and understand your time is valuable. All of your lines have been muted, and we ask that you enter any questions in the chat window. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for download on our website at www.netxinc.com. I will now turn it over to Kyle for the presentation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Hi again, my name is Kyle Black. I am a pre-sales engineer for Bay Dynamics. Today I'm going to be walking you through a brief presentation around simplifying DLP using Ueda as well as an overall analytics platform. Before we jump in there and actually go see a presentation and go see the demo, I did want to clarify some things here. You're seeing the Symantec logo on the screen. As you know, NetX works closely with Symantec. This product is actually produced by who I work for, Bay Dynamics, and is OEM'd by Symantec. So it's tightly coupled with the DLP platform, as you'll see. There's a lot of great value within it itself. But today we'll be walking through some of those workflows, some of those reports, and some of that added value you get around building in UBA and analytics as a whole. With that, I'm going to step through a few slides here and walk you through a few use cases. We're going to mainly hit on the simplifying DLP use case. That's kind of why we are on here today. Wanted to make sure to highlight a couple additional use cases as well. That within the platform there is a lot of moving parts in the sense of not only are there out of the box use cases around simplifying DLP, as well as you can see here hunting insider threats and analyzing cyber breaches. But there's, at its core, it's an analytics platform. And so there's really a lot that can be gleaned from the data that's put into it. But we're going to stick with DLP data today, focus down on that. You'll see a few other areas where additional data may get correlated. But for the context of today, we're specifically talking about DLP. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about UEBA before we get into the platform. So as we're kind of talking about DLP and the idea of the number of events or incidents that come out of the console, we really want to focus back to what's the need for DLP, and because of that, are the customers we're talking with gleaning enough value out of the DLP console. So first and foremost, kind of just call out some of the business, high level business objectives that are really driving DLP adoption, as well as needing to maintain and update DLP. First is kind of the cloud and DLP pressure mounting, because you guys started talking about how much data is now going out to the cloud. The perimeter is now decreased, needing visibility and control over that, as well as a lot of companies, are now looking into GDPR and trying to understand how they're going to comply with that, how they're going to be really assured that they are complying with those things. So those are just mounting pressures that DLP, having a great foundational ability to describe this data, can be enhanced and amplified so that you're getting as much value out of it as possible. The second point is insider threat remains unsolved, as you see here on the screen. So we'll touch a little bit on that, and the third bullet point of integrated behavioral analytics. But the insider threat story really comes back to, if we talk about DLP from the sense of watching our data and monitoring our data and helping us understand where it's going, who owns it, and so on and so forth. Insider threat comes to the story of how do we assure that when somebody's handling that data, that they're not potentially a malicious user who's trying to exfiltrate data because they're moving to another company, because they're trying to sell it to a service someplace. So bringing in a little additional detail helps us start correlating back to those users and start building a profile around them and understanding them from a behavioral standpoint. So we'll see some of that in the demo today of how we can kind of step away from just incident-based management into more of a user-based management. And it's often a maturity curve for most of our customers, moving from one step to the next. But the nice thing you'll see is within the platform, it's really easy to grow along with you. You can choose to use and not use certain functionality. But the great thing is if the data is all there in the platform, when you're ready to flip that switch and move on to phase two, you've got a lot of historical data built around the behavioral, analytics, your own incident management that serves a great purpose of that going forward. And then the last one is that behavioral analytics, integrated piece that, at the end of the day, while we can talk a little bit about DLP, we can talk a little bit about understanding who a user is from a business perspective. What you'll also see is we do go above and beyond that, and we start pulling data from other areas of the enterprise. A couple of examples are activity like authentication activity or even web proxy activity. So understanding outside of just the data itself, what else that user really is touching, interacting with, how normal or unnormal those things are. All this kind of boils back to the value that UEBA delivers on top of each one of these items here. And I think I might have jumped a little bit ahead here. Let me be clear in the fact of UEBA is user and entity behavior analytics. So really focusing on what I'll talk about here in a little bit, unsupervised learning, analyzing both users, but also entities as well. So we can talk about endpoints, IP addresses, applications, things like that within your IT infrastructure that we have what we usually refer to as telemetry data on. Clicking to the next slide here, we're really talking a little bit about how data security monitoring is changing with time and what's pushing those, what are the drivers there, and are those internal, those external, are those from a technology perspective, each one of those. I mean, so for the first is, a lot of our customers that we've worked with, we're seeing a high amount of incidents coming in. And, generally there's, we're seeing enough where there's an overwhelming amount where the analysts aren't able to actually get to every single incident. So there's a lot of area that's left, untouched and gray that we might be monitoring that data, but we don't necessarily have the ability to fully understand what that incident or event might mean. We spoke a little bit about insider threats as well. So again, how, a lot of companies today really are having a difficult time of how to build those user profiles, understand what those users do from a day-to-day basis without specifically prescribing it. There's a lot of great rules and scenarios out there that we can talk about, and some of them we'll actually show you inside the platform. But there's a lot of great known bad conditions. But what about the unknown bad conditions? That's really what we're trying to understand here from an insider threat perspective of identification of when, users begin to deviate from, what their expected behavior is, as well as what the expected behavior of users like them with the same manager or in the same department are as well. So each one of these can kind of bring back and build a profile with the data that we're pulling into the platform to help illustrate what a user's behavior looks like and how that might change over time. And then lastly is that visibility and remaining exposure there. So by bringing in different data streams, as you'll see here in a little while as well, in that kind of phase 2, phase 3 of a maturity curve, we can start painting a bigger picture as well of, do I have full agent coverage within my network? Do I actually know, am I able to observe enough of this data going out across the wire? Doing some of that policy analysis to really understand, am I capturing everything I need to? And are there areas where I'm maybe over capturing and I'm seeing a very significant amount of my events are always dismissed or are always false positives? Coming back and using that insight to create that feedback loop is a little bit of what we'll hit on as well. So lastly, kind of the three big areas again, we're going to simplify DLP here. We're going to help pinpoint and prevent insider threats by correlating back to users. And then with that overall umbrella, help with the visualization of, overall cyber breach culture in that sense of really driving towards where I might have gaps in visibility, where I might need to step those things up. So first, kind of deep dive into the simplifying DLP policy management and incident management. I want to show you one or two slides here around what we're talking to from a business perspective and then what we're talking to from a technology perspective. So kind of as I was hitting on earlier, there is the concept of, there's a lot of DLP data out there, and DLP does a great job of tracking where my, actual activities happening in a network. Is it on the endpoint? Is it on the network itself? Is it going out across a egress? Is it, how is it being handled at the end of the day? And for a lot of customers we talk to, what we realize is there's a good amount of data within that set of DLP data that is very helpful for monitoring and assurance reasons, but could necessarily be automated as low risk, normal activity. And we'll show you how we identify some of that with the behavioral analytics qualities of the platform. From a reporting often that are often tagged, as being acceptable. And then also plucking out the needles in the haystack of what is abnormal and high risk at the same time. So really taking the data from DLP and enriching it to a standpoint of having a better understanding of priority is really what we're trying to get out from an incident triaging perspective. And from a remediation perspective, if we were to take a step back and not just work from a incident by incident basis, is there ways we can group these things together to accelerate remediation so we can see where there might be not just an event but a story in place, and which one of these are ones I can easily mitigate today or put a new control in quickly today versus what are the high risk ones that I could create a bucket out of and I need to spend the majority of my time focusing on and remediating to make sure I'm reducing that risk inside of my data architecture. And then lastly is the feedback loop. Really is the way I always allude to it, is simplifying policy management in that sense of being able to analyze what's coming out of the activities within the platform itself, the workflows of the incidents, being able to identify where false positives might be occurring, being able to identify where events are truly low risk and where I might not be seeing enough. So with the analytics engine, the reporting engine that's built in, that's one of the great outcomes that we'll see in the demo today. So to speak to a little bit of how we do it, then from a technology perspective, is for DLP itself. Really, all we're doing is pulling in that data directly. There's opportunity to pull in things like Active Directory HR data, which I'll show you here in a little bit, is kind of the step 2. But we have a very tightly coupled integration with Symantec DLP that's a two-way feed. So we pull over the meta details directly from DLP into our platform. We use those to do our analysis, to do our behavioral scoring. The payload, the files, those things are maintained in the console back there. Any workflow that is done on our side also flows back. So that's that two-way feed there, that we can mirror the workflow that you have in DLP today and ensure that any actions or outcomes on the ICA platform side reflect back in the system of record, which is the DLP console. So that's what we're trying to bring out here at the end, is a prioritized list of incidents and identifying those risky users from a behavioral standpoint. And so we spoke a little bit about that idea of behavioral analytics, and this is really our analytics engine at its core, as I'm showing you here. And I want to hit on this before we jump into the environment, because this will kind of show you what we do with the data. So we spoke about how we're pulling directly from DLP itself. The first thing we do is actually data enrichment, in the sense of depending on the amount of input streams we have. So in this case, it could be DLP, it could also be DLP plus Active Directory at HR. We're going to start filling in the gaps. And that could even go a step further, as you'll see here in a little bit. If we're pulling telemetry, say from something like an endpoint, and I see an event on an endpoint, but I might not have a user correlated to it, some of the probabilistic approach we're doing is we're looking in multiple sets of data to find, okay, do I know a user from DLP that was logged in around the same time that endpoint event happened, or expanded out even further? And we've talked a little bit about authentication data and web proxy data. I may not know which user actually requests an outbound connection to a blocked website if you're not storing that data from a proxy standpoint. But at the same time, again, if I have endpoint data that allows me to understand who the user on the endpoint is, we're starting to take that Venn diagram, push it closer together so we have more overlap and fill in the blanks where we can. So that's kind of phase 1, is a deduplicating and enrichment of these core data sources as they come in. Step 2 is that predictive analytics there, or really the behavioral analytics. So we normalize the data sets into the step buckets that they are. So speaking of DLP, we have a standard model for DLP, data that's coming in. So while Symantec is, a premier integration point, there's also, we've also integrated in the past with customers who use homegrown DLP systems or potentially competitor solutions as well. We can pull in multiple consoles all at once. So that way you have one unified set, which is awesome and a big value add a lot of our customers, where you're, again, going down to that normalized data set, and then we're doing those predictive analytics on top of it. So what we're looking at then is, from an event standpoint, we're taking an event and we're comparing it to that user's history, which usually goes back 90 to 120 days. And we're trying to identify, is it usual or unusual? We have a few different outcomes. It can be highly consistent all the way to highly unusual. There's 5-step scale in the middle, with normal being the middle. So that's really what we call unsupervised learning, in the sense of it only matters about the data underneath the hood at the end of the day. So if we have a data pool to compare these from, we're going to take that DLP event, we're going to analyze it from a behavioral standpoint, and we're going to score it out. Is it normal or abnormal? Then on top of that is where we're actually going to go into a scenario analysis. So this is where we can start correlating some of those known bad conditions in. And so we can even build on top of the behavioral analytics, as you'll see in the demo, where we could do something like show me unusual incidents, but also show me unusual incidents where that user may have a known termination date. They put in their 2-week notice. If that's the case, when that incident fires, that can go into a special work queue where it says, I want to see specifically incidents that meet this criteria. Or you could even, do a time series evaluation as well. So I want to see users who've tried to move something onto USB or blocked, and then they try to upload it to a cloud website. Those would be married together. Then we'd have a group of incidents now that would be able to work from a more holistic standpoint than just an incident by incident triage. So that's a scenario analysis piece that I'll show you. There's quite a few of those out of the box, as well as the configurable, functionality within our platform that you can create your own scenarios on the fly from simple searches. And then lastly is stack ranking of it all. So that's really where the prioritization comes down, is taking all the data that we've brought in from the very beginning, analyzed and grouped together, and then stacking it out into who are the most risky users, which are the incidents that I should be addressing first that have the highest risk and are also potentially, very abnormal for those users to work on. That's that stack ranking that comes out at the end of the day. So that way you can understand where in your enterprise to spend your time, where your focus should be, versus which of those events could be more automated from a standpoint of, this is a data monitoring policy that allows us to, manage compliance, versus, those lower, 40, 60% of events that are, often noise to a certain degree. Those get deprioritized, and the ones get brought up to the top of the ones that stand out from the crowd. I'm going to pause here real quick just to look at my chat. I know that, if you guys have any questions, feel free to throw those in there. I know we haven't got quite to the platform yet, but I'll keep checking back to see if we have any questions, or I'll allow the NetX team to interrupt me if we've got something relevant at the time. So lastly, before we move into that live demo, the next next slide and the next that we're going to talk about here is around the machine learning capabilities of the platform itself. So we've been speaking a lot about analytics, and really at its core, it's a patent machine learning algorithm that's employed in 2 different ways. One is that unsupervised machine learning. So I'll start here on the right that we talked a little bit about. The ability to denoise that data set by identifying the abnormal events, bring up the events that are creating correlated groups that as they come out of the console itself, and prioritize on top of all of that. So unsupervised strictly means that it's just about the data at the end of the day that we have in the platform. This is a day one value point for us, meaning we can backload data from DLP and immediately start analyzing the events as they come in. So we don't need weeks and weeks to learn about the data. That the backloading of data will provide us that baseline, and then as new events come in, we will actually compare them to the baseline. The interesting thing on top of that as well is we can actually go back and recalculate how normal or abnormal event is in the past as well. So if on day one when an incident came in, it was comparatively normal for that user, or a user with that same manager, so a peer of that user, but then 90 days down the road, there was a significant change in how data is handled by that team, or the actual job function of that team, that incident can actually be recalculated and now stand out further. Now, if it's been dismissed and triaged and mitigated, that can still be off of our list of things to address. But if that's something that sat at the bottom of the stack for a long time, and then all of a sudden looks strange to what that user's been doing for the last 90 to 120 days, that could push its way up the priority list. And now we're not just, looking at incidents from a day one perspective, we're looking at them from a more holistic perspective. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the supervised machine learning piece, which is actually where the input from the end user comes into play. So as you take actions within the console will actually learn what a acceptable versus a true violation looks like. So we'll show you that a little bit in the demo as well. But what this means is, as new events come in, the console will learn, if this event looks similar to an event from 60 days ago, and really a group of those events, right? We start needing to build that baseline, that confidence level, that if every time an event comes in of a certain quality, let's say it's violating the same policy, let's say it's always over the same protocol, let's say it's always with about the same amount of data, same match count that's in there, right? We might have a user who handles, mortgage applications in the processing department. So as long as there's one social security number that's going out, over email, and that only occurs, one or two times, or maybe a day, right? As those new events come in, and as each time you've dismissed them and said this is acceptable, it's a broken business process, and it is a risk, but it's acceptable for this to do, aka the DLP team or the information security team is not going to take, not going to kick off an investigation for this or augment the process at this time. So if we push those off and we keep dismissing them each time in whatever way that we do, that supervised machine learning will look the next time a similar incident comes in that matches that profile, and it will basically take that guess and say, I think this is an acceptable event. Now that can always be reversed, but essentially we're trying to help automate and prioritize the events that stand out again versus the ones that you continually are processing the same way. So that's one of the great aspects of the supervised machine learning, that as the console is used, it gets better and better, and that can be tightly integrated into your DLP workflow. So it's not an extra step to go do that. You don't have to step outside and actually, make that justification or anything. If we say we come in and if we mark it as dismissed, that's an automatic acceptable notion versus if we provide a risk rating to it or something, that's an automatic violation. Those are items that we can configure and couple together over time. So to quickly touch on the other two use cases here that you'll see in the platform just briefly. One is around insider threats itself. And this the key piece here comes into understanding the business and the organization as a whole. So DLP events get married to essentially HR data or Active Directory data. Start building those groups to start understanding who they are, the company, what their role is. And we really pivot from like I said, an incident perspective into a user perspective. So at the end of the day, it's very, very similar data set. It's just really of the who and the what are we trying to get out of it? Are we trying to dismiss DLP events or identify the true risk DLP events that need to be escalated and actually remediated? Or are we trying to identify potential insider threats or potential well-meaning but high-risk users inside the platform as well? So we'll touch a little bit on that because that's a great value add that comes out of the DLP simplification process, and over time can be grown into when it's put in the right domain of a company. So if we're engaging the right people, those InfoSec teams, those security operations teams, those are the people that more often are going to be concerned with who are my people that I want to focus on versus what are my events I want to focus on. And so I kind of spoke just briefly about this. Is really that Active Directory and HR data is what comes in here. So starting group people together, start understanding more details about them. Are they a contractor or are they an internal employee? Do they have an upcoming dismissal date? Are they in a sensitive organization? Those pieces start helping us paint a bigger picture that then can correlate back to what is insider threat really look like. And then lastly, cyber breach analytics. I won't spend a lot of time on this. This is really above and beyond what the conversation is today. But what we're really focusing on is we're escalating that insider threat conversation into a holistic cybersecurity conversation, in the sense of maybe it's not just inside users that I'm concerned about, but potentially somebody compromising the user account. So those phishing scenarios and even those command and control scenarios where we have a rogue agent on the network someplace that's actually hijack an endpoint, and it is starting to scan the network for certain activity, trying to brute force log into servers as it discovers them, is phoning home back to a home server, over the web. So we're seeing a lot of strange web activity. That's really where it's coming in from a cybersecurity breach automation process, in the idea that we're trying to identify those areas. And by using several different data sets, so here you're seeing DLP, you're seeing endpoint from Symantec, as well as cloud security, data encryption, data tagging, as I spoke about earlier, authentication information, web proxy information. All of those start really making as big a picture as we possibly can around my users and entities. So we're talking about users as well as we're talking about endpoints and servers and applications and those things. So it's very much something that is, needs to be defined to what an organization is. There's a lot of value in the fact of getting all the data in one place and being able to compare it, correlate it, and report on it over time. With that, I'm going to pivot and go into the demo environment and walk us through a brief demo around DLP simplification. Before I do that, I'm going to just double check that there's nothing in the QA. Okay. So we will flip over here to the web interface itself. So here you're seeing the Information Centric Analytics UI. It is a web platform at the end of the day, and underneath the hood is SQL Server. So while there's a lot of other tools out there that you might hear that come across in the behavioral analytics space, a lot of them are really those next gen sims that are really looking at the big data of it all, in the sense of trying to throw Hadoop and Mongo at these scenarios, creating these data lakes. We have patented algorithms within the SQL Server processes themselves to compress and analyze this data. We handle hundreds of millions of events inside the platform. So from a DLP perspective, it's really, apples to apples from what we're pulling over. So we're very, very, aware of what we're doing in those cases here. So, it's a known platform that is usually widely adopted at most of our customers, which allows us to build on top of it these great analytics that you're going to see today, these great workflows that are on top of it. It allows us to be really flexible in the integration realm as well. Like I said, the DLP connection is a database to database connection, meaning we're able to handle a lot more big batches of data versus going over something like an API. So here on the platform itself, I want to pivot before we come back to the incidents. I want to start us at a dashboard. So this is my insider threat dashboard, and what it's doing is it's actually rolling up all the DLP incidents that I'm storing in the platform itself. So the first thing you'll see here on the right is an overall trend of data in motion incidents. And as you can see, it'll actually compartmentalize those out by were they on the endpoint, were they on the network. If I'm not concerned with network incidents, you can toggle those off and toggle those on to actually see those. So this is the reporting interface in the back, from the actual back end of the tool itself. It's a great tool to configure custom dashboards with on the fly. I'll show you a little bit about reporting later on from an ad hoc perspective. But we have some great out of the box dashboards that we'll walk through here that show us some value from a day one perspective that are all tailored to DLP data itself. So if I toggle these back on, one thing I can do as well is I can actually drill into that data underneath the hood. So while we're an analytics tool and we do a great job of rolling up this data, reporting on it, and displaying it in a more meaningful format, at the end of the day, you can get to the underlying data sets that are there. So this is showing me all the DLP incidents that have come over, the user details themselves, as well as I can go ahead and actually drill through that. So in this case, I can go straight to the user. If I want to go straight to the incident, that's also something we could have enabled here as well. So you're really allowed to kind of walk through the data set as you feel. That there's a lot of great workflows that are kind of pre-established here. But from a data discovery perspective of starting at a high level of, do I see a spike and do I want to drill into that to help understand it? Do I want to get to the core data? Was there a user within that spike that generated a large amount of the data? Was there a business unit that was there? We can start gleaning this information from drilling through and understanding the data at its core. Down here below as well, you can see the top risky users. So we're showing you a trend there, and we'll go through the incident management perspective. And down below here, you can see there's the actual risky users themselves. So like I called out earlier, what we're doing on top of just pulling the instances is we're correlating these back to the users themselves. So you can see here, there's a number of users, and they all have a risk score of 100. And we'll show you how we got to that score one thing to keep in mind is a score of, it's out of 100, but those are percentile rankings. So this user is in the 100th percentile of risk inside the organization. And that could come from the amount of DLP events they're generating, the type of DLP events they're generating, the policies that they're violating. Any number of factors can provide input into what the score of the user is. But as you'll see when we come back here later, we can marry these incidents to those users. So not only correlating and reporting on it, but when I start to actually do my incident management, I could focus on the incidents that Nico's generated first, and I'll show you how we get to those, versus actually just walking through the most high severity items. So I maybe would want to focus first on the high risk users that have generated high severity unusual events that we'll see later on here too. So if I click on search for user here, this will actually bring up Nico's user profile at the end of the day. So each user is going to have their own profile screen that's rolling up their data, and it's going to give us some great information around who they are and what they do. So you can see here at the top, we can see things like who their manager is. We can see where they actually work. If I drop this down, I can see that this user is an internal employee, and I can even potentially see, do they have a planned departure date? Have they even left the company? That's often a very, very big red flag that if Active Directory is telling me that the account has been retired, there's DLP events being generated. That's a very quick standout scenario for us. But this gives us some great detail around who the user is. And then down below, we're getting that risk ranking score from these vectors that sit down here. So out of the box, we have quite a few risk vectors. I believe it's around 20 or so. And depending on the type of data you have, they're going to automatically populate. You can also tailor these to your organization as well. As I explain these, it will make a little bit more sense. So you can see, to take one of these times, for instance, each one of these is showing where this user is in the overall organization. So let's start with, before we go to the behavioral ones, let's start with the true DLP events themselves. So high severity DLP events that are coming in. He's in the 85th percentile of generating the amount of data that, than anybody else in the organization. You can see down below there too, there's these two groupings that then populate as well that show me what an average user looks like. In this case, this green is the same department, and what the average user looks like with the peers with the same manager. So it's taking them and it's comparing them out. So not only are they, high on the list from the standpoint of just overall event generation for high severity unusual incidents, but as well, they stand out far from anybody within their organization or anybody with the same manager. So you can see we're bringing in DLP information here, as well as potentially those other data sources as we were talking about earlier, authentication activity, even web activity itself. And then we can also then, really create our own on top of that. So those known scenarios that we were kind of referencing earlier, here's one to call out specifically: the multiple methods per hour. So we're creating a scenario in the case of, does Nico often violate DLP policies on one protocol and then switch to another, and do that within the same hour? So like we kind of said earlier, does he try to write to a USB stick and then go to Gmail and try to upload it directly from there? Is he blocked and allowed? Are all of these passes? Any one of these things can be used to tailor this scenario, and then we can use that again as another indicator of risk. So we can roll up and now see that he's in the 90th percentile of generating events that marry into the multiple methods per hour. Some of our customers bring in information around what type of access does this person have? So are they a high privileged user? Are they in a sensitive business unit? Or do they work with outside contractors? All of those can help add to that overall indicator of risk that then can roll up into that score at the end of the day. And then what that allows me to do then, like I kind of called out earlier, is really work my incident management, my incident management process from that prioritization of really, who is this user to the organization? What kind of impact do they have? We're going to come back to this risk recommendation section here in just a second. I want to call out a couple other areas of the platform. First is just the timeline that we can see when these events come in. They're built out in a timeline fashion. So if you want to follow that series of events over time and see, was there, endpoint event, a web activity event, did DLP catch it? Different items like that. Each one of these events come back, and we can always go see the core event itself. We can also do our review here too. So while this is kind of a simple workflow, what this allows us to do is provide that input to that supervised learning engine there. So if I switch this to acceptable, that's going to tell me in the future that if Nico generates a copy move confidential file with about 10 matches at a certain time of day and so on and so forth, that there's a good chance that could be actually a business justifiable event, although risky. So that can happen in the timeline, as well as you can go to the overall roll-up of all of the events this user has generated. So if I go here, I can see the buckets of DLP events, the buckets of endpoint events that are here. And then at the bottom of the screen, I'll see for all the scenarios and conditions in which he qualifies. So it looks like Nico has about 290 DLP instances have come in. Of those, looks like there's a subset. 26 of them have been flagged as very unusual. 107 are unusual, and then a few are left to be unscored as they might be out of our time range. Scrolling down, you'll see those DLP incidents themselves. We'll go into what an incident looks like here in a minute, but just wanted to kind of call out. You can see them directly from here. You're able to actually workflow them as well and escalate them into other people's work queues. We have a native workflow engine built into the platform, but just like I said earlier, that if this was enabled back to the DLP console, these results could flow back. That's that two-way feed that's coming in here that would notify DLP that this is, a false positive, that this is a dismissal, that this is an escalation. Each one of those items could actually happen back in DLP, or you can keep it on our side as well and use our ticketing system and processing. Down below too, other thing I want to call out is the actual groupings as well. So while this is always great data, having the core incidents themselves, letting the platform do a lot of the work when it comes to grouping and understanding those can often accelerate the remediation process. So I can look down here and see, from the standpoint of broken business process, it looks like Nico's events have qualified as, he's generating events that have been identified as departmental level broken business processes, team level broken business processes, or he's also been flagged as repeatedly violating the same policy. So again, that if that's a acceptable scenario where this is something he needs to do for work, where he's handling, in this case, source code, I could go in and, like we saw earlier, I could flag those in there. I could actually jump directly into those events, and I'll show you what a group of events looks like here in a little bit. But that's some of that acceleration that's coming into play there, that we're starting to group those events together and try to build a story around them. So if I go back here to the top and click over to the risk level, this will take me into the risk recommendations for Nico himself. So this is kind of how we were showing earlier, that we want to focus the amount of time we spend on the most significant incidents. And there's a few ways we can weigh these out. Often that's a criticality from a policy level, or a mapping to policy weighting. So if if I am a healthcare corporation and I'm very, very highly concerned with PII and PHI, I can value those policies from a higher weight perspective than I might from internal identifiers, prefixes, postfixes, file types, those items. So this can help kind of create these scenarios where we're seeing here that it's focusing on maybe one event or maybe a group of events as well. So we'll jump into this event here to actually look at this policy where Nico has touched a confidential file. It's obviously ranked very high, short of actually seeing advanced malware command and control on the device. It is my most significant event from a risk reduction recommendation. So if I click on that, that's going to take me to an actual event page here. So I'll jump right into the actual DLP event itself. So this will pull back the meta details of that event. So just like we saw those workflow buttons earlier, the exact same is going on here. On the left side is the meta details as they came in. So if this was automatically, scored from the supervised learning, we could see what happened there. In this case, we haven't seen this enough, so it's been left in the unreviewed stage. You can see the policy and the rules that have been violated, as well as the match count. So I can know that Nico tried to, move about 10 pieces of sensitive data around, count numbers, it looks like, as they were here. As well as, obviously, it was passed too. So we do know that data is out there. On the right side is the actual user details themselves. So this is some of the enrichment that we're doing, that if we had, the sub-department and the departure date, we'd have that information in here. There's a link back to their profile. So if we started this from an incident management perspective, we could always back our way into trying to understand the user from a more holistic standpoint. But really the great thing that's come out of here as well is if I scroll down, there's that behavioral info. So this event has been compared to his history as well as the histories of peers with the same manager and peers in the same department. And out of 1 out of 100 means it is highly, highly unusual. As that number gets bigger, as it approaches 100, it's more and more consistent. So we can see not only is this unusual for him, but this is unusual for peers with the same manager and peers in the same organization. So this would definitely be something that's placed on a priority list, because not only is Nico a high-risk user, but he's now generated a very unusual incident on a very sensitive policy. Down below too, you'll see some destination information that are coming back here. The files themselves called out, and this is actually, I'll make sure to be clear here. This is not a link to the file itself. This would show me other events that have actually contain that same file name. That information would be there, as well as what the remediation state is and any changes that might have occurred over time. To that point, though, of the file itself, we do have this View Dim Payload button here on the top right of the screen. And while it's not enabled live in this environment, if I was integrated directly with a DLP console and I had this permission enabled for a DLP administrator, the administrator would not need to go to the DLP console to actually see the payload. They could actually see the matches, the message information, the policy violation details directly into this UI as well. This is not persisted. This is an API call, so there's no data sensitivity issues. The second I close that, that blows the data away. That it never touches our database. We never hold any of that sensitive content. There's also the ability, of course, to turn on a deep link too. So if you don't want people calling the payload directly, but you want somebody to log directly into the console to work on this, they could click the View and DLP button, and that would take them directly down there. So I could choose to workflow this. I could choose to classify in this case, but I've actually walked, as you've seen so far, from a dashboard into a user all the way down to one of their more sensitive incidents. If we take a step back right now, the one other thing, we kind of do want to focus on is this data in motion dashboard itself. So the concept of what if I were just to look directly at the incidents themselves, not work from a dashboard, not work from a user. This is really the roll up and the work queues that come back from using DLP to gather the data. So, we kind of talked a little bit about high severity, unusual incidents. So we can see these have all been flagged as, high severity from a DLP standpoint, but also, actually have, also been tagged as unusual by our behavioral engine. Here's that multiple methods per hour scenario that's been painted here. So this is a known bad condition that we can configure. Those are, there's quite a few down here as well that we'll go through, as well as there's just general roll-ups of the events. So if I want to jump directly into the new DLP events for today or for this week that are in the high status, I can absolutely do that. One thing I want to jump into, though, is the idea of the broken business process, or the idea of how do we help with the automation and optimization of the DLP workflow. So if I click on this broken business process bucket, it'll give me 3 different groups that we have configured out of the box. One is a repeat policy offender, so someone who has generated 10 plus events on the same policy in that week, and then the team broken business process and department broken business process, where everyone on that team is violating the DLP policy 50 times or 100 times or more. So alluding to the fact that there's likely a business legitimate reason these people need to be handling this data, but also identifying again that we have a potential exposure here that, if I have 357 groups of teams that are, having basically high volume incident generation, I can see, from this standpoint, who the manager is in each one of these teams, the number of events that are in it, who the organization is. And then if I wanted to, let's say I want to tackle this group, this manager group that's in the R&D organization. I can click on that number there, and this will bring me into a incident grouping page. So we saw an incident specifically earlier for Nico where we went straight to the incident. There's also the concept of, these can be grouped together at a user level, at a manager level, by, like we called out earlier, at a file level. So if we know the file name, if we're looking for a certain outbound site or something like box.com, you can start grouping these instances together and picking them apart during your incident management process. So a DLP analyst can come in here and see quickly, of this team, they, in the last week, they've generated 1.1 thousand incidents. Of those, only 23 were unusual. There was actually a good chunk, almost a quarter of them, were normal, meaning we've seen them or seen things like them quite a few times. As well as you can see here, even in the match count, of the ones that were unusual, there's very few comparatively to the overall normal aspect here. So we have almost 100,000 pieces, or more than 100,000 pieces of data being touched. But again, a good chunk is normal for us. We can see the top offenders within this group and anything that's in common here. So we knew that this was the same manager, and they were in the R&D department. We can also see here that every time they have been blocked, or potentially, are they all coming from the same domain? Are they all coming from the same endpoint? If this was one user, you can use each one of those items, see it over time, and then once we know kind of what's in common here, we can start picking this apart from a differences perspective. So I can see the different the policies that have been violated here. Again, we kind of talked a little bit about the users ranked out. We can see there's quite a few users in here. If other is, our general, because we're only showing the top 10. So everybody, even though there's this Albertina, she only has 11 violations. There's another 1,000 on top of that are other users that are out there. So there's a good chance everybody's violating this a small amount of time over time, seeing details like the date and the channel itself. So if I'm particularly worried about the network channel, I can drill in to the subset of incidents that are in there, and I can filter the entire set down from over 1,000 incidents into a subset, which I believe is about 200 incidents there. So to recalculate each one of these reports, allow me to keep drilling down into them. And then, of course, I can see the direct details here on the last page. So just the same instance as we saw earlier, I can link out to the users. I can drive into the instance. I can bulk process them if I wanted to flag them as business acceptable. Each one of these items allows me to quickly workflow each one of them, as well as in the event that I need to, of course, escalate it to the appropriate resource. So all very, very great data coming in there, letting you reflect what's in DLP without the need to tab over to another screen to grab that data, as well as the enrichment that's brought forth there. Last thing I want to show you here with the 10 minutes that we have left, I want to drive into our analyzer tool. So this is the backend analytics engine that's sitting out there. It's an OLAP cube, meaning nightly we're processing all of these events. We're starting to bucket them, so that way we don't have costly reports to run during the day. A lot of the dashboards are built off of these cube reports, but if I look into it, I can start seeing some what we call saved views. So in this case, I can see there's some dim event classification by organization, but let's drill into this data in motion. Incident policy and rule analysis for the last 90 days. This starts telling that story around policy improvement, policy optimization, trying to, from a 10,000 foot view, understand what's happening in our DLP practice and identify areas for improvement, identify areas for tuning that have come out of it. So this view is loaded here, and as you can see, there's a number of counts that are coming out of it. On the left-hand side here, we have the high-level policies, so things like competitor communications, confidential documents. And then I can see, of those incidents, what status are they sitting in right now? So if we take this confidential documents item, for instance, we can see that of the total almost 6,000 incidents, 3,000 of them have been closed, and about 1,500 of them have been actually escalated. If I hover here for a second, you'll see a pie chart pop up that'll actually allow you to understand the slices. So a little bit easier from this perspective. We only have a few different outputs that could actually be there. But if you wanted to pull together a report, then you could actually generate a chart directly from here. So it looks like it was taking a second there, so we'll move on. But I could also see, of those escalated, there were a few escalated particularly to the security team directly. So we might have asked for some level 2 support on about 1,500 of them. About 900 of them went straight to our information response team to understand the exposure that might have been on that data itself. You can drill into it. And so like in the case of this confidential communications here, it looks like we've got about 300 right now in the new stage. If I open it up, I can break down the individual rules or conditions that are generating each one of these incidents. So now, again, we can kind of dial back to identifying potential areas for improvement or potential areas where maybe we're generating too much information. So if I were to look specifically at the closed here, I can see that there's a few areas where I'm getting 400s on the closed that are not being escalated. So in the case of the competitor list here, 100 of them have been escalated, 200 have been, or to the information response team, security team, and then 200 have been escalated to a level 2. But there's still, half of them have just been closed out. That may be an area to go in and actually start doing some analysis around. Is that, policy casting too wide a net, or are there areas, of low count thresholds, as we're approaching the lower 100s, where maybe I don't have as broad of a rule that might be out there. So there's some good details that come in here, and this is also our ad hoc interface. So while I loaded a view that was out there, if I wanted to go in and filter down, I can quickly select any one of these dimensions that we have and start saying, okay, maybe I don't want to see anything that was escalated or in progress or new. I just want to see, actually, let's go just new and close there. So this will quickly recalculate. We had roughly, 500,000 DLP events or so, and now allows me to put together a quick report just focused on those two types that are there. And I apologize, I think I clicked a little too fast. Hope this will collapse out for me. And so I can actually use each one of those statuses on rules. I can remanage the actual date range that is in there. We can change that filter up. Or here on the right is my actual pool of measures and dimensions, as we call them. Measures are the numbers at the end of the day that, the count of DLP incidents. The dimensions allow me to kind of cut and chop that data there. So maybe I'm concerned with, let's go to protocol itself. So maybe I want to add a protocol filter, and I only want to look at USB events, removable media events. So now I can exclude everything except I'll scroll down and include USB. And now I can even update this report, as you'll see, to a subset of those events that have come out here. And if I collapse this down real briefly, you can see the areas where, password files significantly, higher on the USB count, as well as it looks like financial data stands out versus, some of the lower ones where credit card numbers are not often leaving USB. So maybe we have a very nicely, tightly tuned credit card number policy that's blocking any significant events. But coming back to a observational standpoint, we're seeing account information, financial information going out over the removable media there. That may be an area where we might need to start writing some block policy, some updates there. So there's a lot at your fingertips here at the end of the day from a reporting perspective that allows some great ad hoc reporting. And that always flows back to the dashboard. So these can be posted out to a dashboard. New dashboards can be created. While we saw some very high-level reports around the incidents themselves, the last piece of functionality I want to show you before we close out today is actually the metrics functionality too. So on top of being able to go down to the core data, get those bar charts, those line charts that are out there, we have what we call metrics that allow us to snapshot data over time. So we can see areas in which we're improving, areas in which we're needing improvement. If I drill into these, I can see, in this case, in this quarter, I'm 21% higher on the amount of incidents I'm generating. And you can see, network and endpoint is contributing a little bit to each one of those. If I drill in, I can get the sub metrics that roll up to that overall high level metric. So I can see how many high severity, low severity, unusual events are we generating? Are we trending positive, negative? If I, want to look directly at the very unusual incidents here, it'll actually, again, take me to this snapshot of data from today. I can see the trend over time and see even how it changes on a day-to-day basis. So if I want to drill in, if I want to look into a specific section here, I can use this dashboard to actually do so. And so metrics are great for tracking operational objectives, as well as the use cases themselves can be brought into. So if you start designing and identifying areas, a lot of our customers, work specifically on phishing, where they create a subgroup of users who have been targeted for a phishing campaign, and they try to track over time, the change in the amount, and the outcome really of each one of those events. So you can use, in this case, something like those special accounts here, that if we're trying to decrease the amount of, special accounts where contractors and having tighter monitoring on them, that's something where we can have visibility. And you can see this month, I have a significant increase in the amount of contractor events that have been generated. And that could also while right now we're trying to obviously trend down as it's red, it could be green if it's in the case of we're trying to monitor them better. We're trying to generate more incidents that have better visibility. So it's all about the story you want to tell. It's all about the business, objectives that you have as a company, how you're handling data. But at the end of the day, you've got a great tool set here that's configured out of the box from a DLP perspective to offer day one value, as well as allow you to grow with the platform, start creating those new use cases and start having more visibility into that information security environment. With that, we have it looks like a couple minutes left. I'm just going to pause here real quick, check the Q&A if we have anything. NetX team, do we have anything in the queue right now from a Q&A perspective?
There is nothing in the queue at this time.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, not necessarily go over. I'll hang out here for a little bit longer if there are any questions, if somebody wants to go ahead and type those in. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining. I really appreciate it. I hope this was time well spent for you. We've worked obviously really hard on this product. We'd love to talk to you more about DLP, about this incident management process and how the UEBA works. So if you want to deep dive into it, don't hesitate to reach out to the NetX team. We'll work together to make sure you guys are enabled as best as possible and see how this can deliver value back to your organization.
All right. Thank you, Kyle. And I want to say thank you to all the attendees for taking the time for today's presentation. Again, we'll leave the meeting open here for any questions that you may encounter. Feel free to post those in the chat. Otherwise, thank you and have a very great day.